Good evening and welcome to Charleston on this idyllic evening where Arab spring meets English summer. I couldn't resist that. I hope you'll appreciate Charleston's impeccable timing, though the festival was planned 6 months ago, that we would be talking this evening about Egypt on the day that the election results were announced. I'm delighted to be welcoming our speakers, Ahdaf Soueif and Jon Snow. But before doing so, I just want to thank our sponsor for this event, EFG Private Bank, which has provided very generous sponsorship, not just for this event, but for a number of other events. We're very grateful to them for that. And thank you for the applause on the...
Yes.
Ahdaf is a novelist, journalist, translator, and cultural commentator whose work appears in the pages of The Guardian, The Observer, The Sunday Telegraph, The London Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement, and so on. She was born in Egypt, but lived in England between the ages of 4 and 8, while her mother studied for a PhD. She herself returned to England to study for a doctorate in linguistics. She writes primarily in English, and her debut novel, which is In the Eye of the Sun, was published in 1993. It was followed in 1999 by The Map of Love, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and has now been translated into 21 languages and sold over 1 million copies worldwide. She's also published 2 works of short fiction, Aisha in 1983 and Sandpiper in 1996. And amongst the works she's translated are Mourid Barghouti's Aisor Ramallah, which appeared in 2004. And in 2012 she published Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, a personal account of the first year of the Egyptian Revolution. Jon Snow is a journalist, presenter, perhaps best known for presenting Channel 4 News. He was ITN's Washington correspondent between 83 and 86, then its diplomatic editor, and in 1989 he became the main presenter of the Channel 4 News, to which he brings a unique enthusiasm and vigour. Aside from meeting and interviewing... was he just demonstrating that unique vigour and enthusiasm? Aside from meeting and interviewing an extraordinary roll call of world figures, he's been present for some of the most historic moments in recent history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela, and of course was in Tahrir Square as events unfolded in Cairo in the spring of last year. He's won too many awards to mention, but including a BAFTA, at least 2 Royal Television Society awards, and never afraid of courting controversy, he called earlier this year for tighter regulation of newspapers, believing at the same time that we're poised for journalism's finest hour. So please join me in welcoming Ahdaf Soueif and Jon Snow.
Well, it is a big day to be talking with Ahdaf Soueif, and it would be a big day anyway, were it not to be added to by the election results, which we'll talk about a bit later. But I just wanted, before saying hello to Ahdaf, I just wanted to say something about the book, which is, her publisher tried for 20 years to get her to write a book about Cairo, and in the end it was the revolution that enabled her to write about Cairo, and even then, really, in the end, she writes about the revolution. But it's set in Cairo in an absolutely extraordinary bounce between public mayhem and private moments when she goes around to somebody's house and tries to explain how they can tile key rooms in the house which aren't square. And she's as intense about the tiling as she is about filing her piece for The Guardian. But it's also a very warm book. You feel the heat of Cairo. You feel the warmth of her, I think, passionate, romantic persona. And I just can't say enough about it except to say that it's in the present tense. And that's where I want to begin, because I think the very fact that you write in the present tense makes us part of the revolution. We don't know what the hell's going to happen next. If you'd written it in the past, it would be all over. But it isn't. And in a sense, because it's in the present tense, you feel you don't know what's going to happen next either. Why did you choose the present tense? Because even people who are interested in the technicalities of writing a novel will be interested in the factual grasp of history in the present tense.
Yeah. Right. Well, hello. Hi. I'm very glad to be here on this wonderful day, and even more that I'm talking with Jon. I don't think I made a decision. I mean, actually, this is the first time that it hits me that the book is written in the present tense. What I did very, very much want to do was to was to write a book that was part of the revolution, that was an act within the revolution rather than simply a documentation of it. And there were issues. For example, I started to write it in July under duress, because what John was kind enough not to say was that I had actually signed a contract. You can't see, or I hope you can at least hear, was that I had signed a contract many years ago with my publisher to write a book about Cairo, and I had failed to deliver, having taken a third of the advance, as we writers do. And I hadn't written the book because it was just, Cairo was getting sadder and sadder. And so when Alexandra Pringle called, as I was sitting in Tahir after our communications were switched back on, and said this is the moment for the book about Cairo, I clearly had to do it. So, but by the time I was able to actually sort of sit down and clear some space, it was July, and it was written between July and October. Now, it was quite clear that we were in a different place than we had been in the 18 days. It was also really clear to me, to many of us, that the 18 days were of central importance, not just to the narrative, but to show the way to where we wanted to go, ultimately. And so I needed that the 18 days be central, be alive, not be something that is over and in the past. But I also needed that my reader, who I didn't know when my reader would hold the book in their hands, that the book would give them a clue how to proceed from the story of the 18 days to wherever Egypt found herself when they were reading the book. Indeed, today, for example, that we have these election results, what's the relationship between that and the Egyptian revolution? So I wanted the book to try and do that as well.
Well, and I think it does, but I want to just take us back to the 18 days, because here was this rock-solid regime which you had resisted over many periods, and there had been a great deal of activism on the side, some secular, some Islamic, and the rest of it. But the day dawned, and Tahrir Square filled. And I was there about 3 days after it began, and there were about 100,000 people in the square, maybe 200,000, I don't know. I mean, a very, very large number of people, maybe 300,000. You can't count, actually, once you get to that point. You've run out of football grounds. You know that Arsenal has, 78,000 seats, and you've passed that, and then you think, well, what about Manchester United? I don't know, maybe I've never been there. So you haven't got anything to compare it with, but it's got very big. And you arrive in the square, and some of the people actually want to do you harm, and the vast majority of people long to have you with them. And so you're moving around, and some of them are barracks for thugs and the rest of it. And I was really moving aimlessly with my crew, just trying to understand where I was and what I was doing. I recognized that it was a fairly middle class. Some religious people, but mainly middle class, secular. And suddenly, I saw this woman I knew, and it was Ahdaf. How could you run into Ahdaf Soueif without telephoning or anything? I didn't even have a mobile, so I didn't know how to get hold of her. I didn't even know whether she would be there anyway. I wasn't looking for her, and we literally tripped over each other. How was that?
Well, wonderful things happened. I mean, people actually really did just run into each other. Everybody was there. I mean, I describe in the book how I kept meeting friends whom I knew were working in Washington or Brussels or somewhere in the world, and there they would be. And it was like, well, of course you would be here. And so while it was like amazing and wonderful to see you, it also sort of wasn't surprising, because this
and yet it was surprising, because you were doing something that was totally illegal. You were doing
having a revolution.
Having a
yes.
revolution, and you'd been told repeatedly you couldn't have a revolution, and it had started. And the extraordinary thing being there was that as each day passed, you realised it couldn't be rolled back. How soon did you realise that you were going to get away with it? I mean, get away with even being there?
No,
you must have thought you were going to be shot.
That's a hard formulation. Being shot was only ever theoretical, because even though people were being shot, and I mean we lost hundreds of people, yet the numbers were so large that basically, again, the odds were really in your favor, unless you know, like the army started using cannon, and after the day that they flew the F-16s and everybody laughed, it seemed that that just wasn't going to happen. Sorry, where were we?
Well, how you got away with it?
How we got away with it?
Why
When did we
couldn't
know?
you have done this 10 years ago?
Ripeness is all. You know, I mean...
Seize the time, Bobby Seale said.
Seize the time, Bobby Seale, ripeness is all, said Shakespeare. Basically, things had to come together. And of course we've asked ourselves this question, because really, we had all been waiting for something to happen for a long time. The country had been in a state of protest since the end of the year 2000. It was intermittent until about 2005, and then from 2005 onwards, it was constant. There was always somebody who was out there protesting, who was at odds with the regime, with the government. But and so there was always the question: when is it going to spill over, and what form will that take? And probably, actually, Tunis was really, really important, because the fact that Tunis managed to get rid of Ben Ali meant that it could be done.
Anything was possible.
It could be done. And so, therefore, the call for protests that went out for the 25th of January was, of course, National Police Day, which is why the protesters chose it as a day to go out against the government and security and the police and so on. But we'd had very, very many, as I said, we'd had ongoing protests for about 10 years. But what made that one different, I guess, was that Tunis had actually managed to remove one dictator. And
but the interesting thing is there were two tangoing, because it wasn't just you who understood from Ben Ali's removal in Tunisia that you could do it, but Mubarak understood it too. I mean, so both sides suddenly knew that something could happen. And actually the army wasn't sent out to kill everybody.
Well, we don't know, because the army was sent out. You'll remember that on the 28th, the revolution actually defeated the security forces in actual battle, even though it was unarmed and it was being killed, and yet it was actually a battle, a physical battle, and they were routed, and they retreated, and they just left all the cities, and basically there was no security, no police, no nothing. And also they opened jails and set sort of, criminals free and so on and so on. So then the army was sent down. Now, what was stated to be its brief was that Mubarak had sent out the army to help security maintain law and order. So, in fact, who knows what that was supposed to have meant. In the event, what they said was that they had decided that they would never shoot at the Egyptian people. And we decided to believe them, because that had been their history. Because twice before, in the 70s and the 80s, they had actually refused direct orders to shoot protesters. So when they said that, we believed them. Now, later on in the Mubarak trial, of course, Field Marshal Tantawi he bore witness in court under oath that he had never been given an order to shoot at the protesters, which then opened the question, why then did they sit down and decide not to shoot us? Is that always a possibility? Like, do they every day sit down and decide not to shoot citizens? Or what was it that day that made them make that decision? So, but they didn't for the 18 days. They did plenty afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But just to go back to your question, when did we know? I think that after the 28th, after what happened on the 28th, after the battles, after we actually took the ground.
Yeah, they were territorial
physically,
battles.
And the police vanished, and the popular committees went, just formed and went into the streets and maintained security. I think after that point, there was no going back. So whether we were going to win or whether we were all going to be killed, we didn't know. But we knew that we could not vacate that space anymore.
I think for people who perhaps, for whom Egypt is a foreign land, and it is for all of us in some senses, it's worth trying to sort of contextualize this, because when history comes to be written, one of the things which will be said about 2011 was that there was an Arab Spring. And in many ways, I think you would probably agree that Arab Spring has not been a very helpful term, because actually each of the things that have happened, although they have infected the next, they have never been the same as the next. And Egypt, I think, in many ways, was the most different revolution of all, partly because it wasn't actually interfered with by anybody from outside. Libya was interfered by us. Syria is being interfered by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others. Bahrain, I mean, is just horrible and is again interfered by outsiders. Yemen, strange, difficult, very hard to understand. But the thing about Egypt is, and perhaps another bit of contextualization, is simply that when you go to Egypt, you are painfully aware of the most wonderful civilization, of a highly developed people in a remarkable country with a sensational history that is vastly underperforming. Here is the country that should be knocking around at 18th in the world economy and is sitting somewhere down at 97. And that, I think, was what really woke me up about Tahrir Square, because you saw it. You saw these scientists, these engineers, these writers, these authors, you.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the realization had been gradually dawning that that this wasn't a question. I'm sorry, this is meant to be a literary festival. I don't know what we can do about this, really.
Well, I tried to talk to you about writing in the present tense, but you said but you never thought about writing in the present tense. So that was my opening sawtooth. But don't blame me.
Okay. That we were realizing that this was not a question of an inept or inefficient or backward or venal regime that was running the country. It was all these things, but it was also a traitor. It was really an occupying force. It was a regime, a system that was running the country, running it down, and running it completely against the interests of the country itself and of its people. And this sense of occupation became actually more graphically present when we had the revolution, because then there was the actual battles on the street, and when you look at footage or you look at photographs, you think you're in Palestine. I mean, you know, the kids throwing stones, the tear gas everywhere, the scarves around the faces, and so on. And then after that, when the army actually moved into the oppositional position that it's taken, you had the barbed wire, you even had concrete walls built in the middle of the city. So the manifestations of an occupation force were there. So yeah, I mean, a country that is underperforming. I mean, Edward Said said something about, he quoted Adorno. Here's a bit of literature. He quoted Adorno, but he made it in relation to the Palestinians, that people who are in danger of being written out of history, of being absent from the march of history. And that certainly was what we felt was happening to us in Egypt. And, you know, we talk about sort of, you know, what a great sense of humor we have and how everything's sort of done with a smile and a joke. But if you actually look at the jokes that we were telling about ourselves in the last 10 years, they were extremely bitter. They were bitter and self-denigrating, and something very, very wrong was being done to the country and to us. And Tahrir
in which we were rather neatly complicit. We, America, Britain, France.
Yeah, well, let's just make it clear that we are very much aware always of the difference between states and people. And so while the official world of
People
the
attend
United
literary festivals. States.
States make weapons and train torturers and train the snipers who killed us and so on. Yes, absolutely. So basically Tahrir was very much, turned out to be our response to that, turned out to be our reclaiming, not just of the country but also of the national character, if you like. That basically we had been told that we were fanatic, we'd been told we were backward, we'd been told we were divided and so on, and all that turned out to be not true, and all that was part of what informed the spirit of the revolution.
I mean, before we sort of bring it to the present day, I do want to visit the book, because there are just the most lovely touches, because at one moment you're down in the square and there's this terrible hubbub going on around, there are people arguing about this and that and all the rest of it, and then suddenly you've sort of gone, I think, to your brother's house or a great friend's house. I go up the ladder to the roof and sit.
No, it's
the pyramids are there. This is Oster Ashraf's house, isn't it?
No, it's a little orchard that my mother bought, and that is a family property which I am in the process of refurbishing.
Can you just read me that paragraph there, because I love it.
Okay.
I go up the ladder to the roof and sit.
All right, so this is this little tiny orchard. I go up the ladder to the roof and sit. The pyramids are there, just beyond those trees. We used to come out to the pyramids at least once a month. We'd run around in the desert, measure our height against the huge rocks of the lowest rung of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, attempt a bit of climbing, and have tea in the king's lodge. The king, Farouk, had lodges at the pyramids, Halwan, Fayoum, all the beauty spots of Egypt, and the 1952 revolution turned them all into cafes for the people. And always, always, we would stand at the edge of the plateau, looking down towards Cairo, and marveling at the definiteness of the line between the desert and the green valley. The line this little bit of orchard is on, the line I am standing on now.
See, that places the city in a most lovely way. But beyond the line, down in that, I mean, there's always this great haze of dust and, you know, I don't know what is hanging in the air, but an awful lot. It is the fact that you can see the pyramids from unlikely moments in the city. And of course they look much nearer than they are, because you think they're much smaller than they are, but they're so big, as you say, measuring yourself against the lowest rock.
Yeah.
I once went to the pyramids when I was a student hitchhiking, and I got out of the bus half a mile too early because I thought we'd arrived. And I got out of the bus went, and oh my God, they're still way away. But they looked out of the bus window as if I was about to miss them. But so you capture that, and you also capture with your own children in the square, your own relatives, your own friends. I mean, there's a constant traffic going on of you going into the square, coming out, mainly to write to keep us all informed in The Guardian and wherever else you were being published at the time. And almost as if you didn't really have time to spend too long in the square because you had to keep feeding the beast outside, feeding us.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I don't know that I would have actually spent the night. I mean, the young people did, and my sister did. But that was pretty tough. And also, I did actually have a lot of media to do, and I had sanction from the young revolutionaries that it was okay for me to go out to do that because you had to talk to people.
I should point out that one night I called her and said, "Could you do us tonight live in the square?" And she said, "Yes, of course I will. Yes." And I said, "I'll send a car." And of course, no car could be found that would go. It was far too dangerous. And I rang London. I said, "Look, what should we do? Because we can't get a car to go to her." "Well, we'll have to drop her." That's a terrible thought. And I rang her, and she said, "I shall drive." You pick up the story.
Yeah, well, basically...
It's in the book, even.
It is. I find that little bit, actually, because I found it because of you.
Oh, God.
Yeah, no,
that's not why I highlight it. I highlight the reality that you took terrible risks to move about because there were no other cars on the street.
Well, the thing is that day I wasn't in the square at all. I was not well. I had this sort of horrible cold, so I was told to stay home and do media. And then there was the Channel 4 News, and I thought it was really important. And they did call and say, well, we can't send you a car because we can't guarantee your safety. So basically, if they sent a car and I was shot in the car, then I would sue them. So.
That was the primary concern.
Yeah.
We weren't insured. We've been on battlefield training courses in order to be prepared for things like Tahrir Square.
Right.
Let me tell you, when we got to the airport, the authorities stripped us of everything could have been of any use whatever. All the flak jackets, stab jackets, all the paraphernalia we carry just in case we are in ugly situations. And nothing we'd ever been trained to do was applicable in Tahrir Square. Not one thing. Nothing told us which was a Mubarak thug and which was a revolutionary. Nobody had taught us any Arabic for a start. If you can only say shukran when somebody needs you in the groin, it doesn't really help.
Shooting you.
But I do say that, and then I remember after the piece taking you to your car, which amazingly was still where you'd left it.
Well, the chap said it would be
shutting the
£10.
door on you, and you not even pressing the lock that locked all four doors, and driving off. And I just thought, I just think we've just seen, a Booker shortlisted writer for the last time.
Yeah. No, I mean basically, and I can't find the section, but it does. I do actually say that. I wish I could find it. It's a good. If you give me a second,
I'll find it while you're talking.
Well.
But actually, being modest, I didn't highlight it.
Oh. Yeah.
But seriously, I wanted to bring it up to the present day. I wanted to illustrate that the book does very much. You really do feel Cairo in it, but you also live the 18 days, and much of the time since. Important periods since. Now we're on a very important day, and in the end, you can have a glorious revolution. And there was something. Joy was it to be alive, without a doubt. It really was an exhilarating thing to be there with people crying, with people laughing, with people engaged in already planning what was going to come after all this. And has it all dribbled away into the sand?
No, absolutely not.
Well, what about these election results? Let's have a look. Who's won? What we've got is the Muslim Brotherhood in first position with 26%. Followed by, can we really cope with it? Ahmed Shafiq, who was the last Prime Minister under Mubarak. That's obviously people frightened of the Islamic Brotherhood. And then your candidate, third, secular nationalist, or Nasserist, as AP called him. Yeah. And then Abdul Fattah. And then Amu Musa, who, of course, being the only man amongst those five who we foreigners knew very well, because he was a foreign minister and he was head of the Arab League. Of course, we all thought, yes, we know Abu Musa, a good man. He'll get there, because he got nowhere. And the other thing is, of course, there's been opinion polls. But try taking an opinion poll in a country which has been riddled with fear, in which people have never had the opportunity actually ever to choose anything. And you're going to get a very distorted result, and so they did.
Well, I think, please forgive me, because these results are just sort of, they haven't even been completed yet, and so we've been just following.
Well, I'm afraid you've only got two.
No, I know that they're not going to change,
yeah.
But what I mean is that it's all very much sort of still happening, and so, one has to have a bit of time to gather one's wits. But
well, talk to us about the Muslim Brotherhood, because they are slightly sanitized from the old Muslim Brotherhood, aren't they? They've cleaned up their act a bit.
Which act?
Long
really.
ago they were.
Oh, well, no, they never. The Muslim Brotherhood have never openly espoused violence. They gave birth to the jihadist groups which took up arms, but the Brotherhood itself, as an organization, has always sort of not. And they've done social work, they've been on the streets, they have actually created a network of health clinics and so on for the last 80 years, and that's all completely true. But I think really just sort of overall, one thing to notice is that the turnout is under 50%. So that is really important, particularly when you look at the turnout that happened in the first sort of exercise in voting, which was the really bad idea referendum that the army put in place in March 2011, and where the turnout was over 80%. So, and it's less, again, than the people who turned out for the parliament, which was about 54%. So really, really, how one could read this, and this is why I'm saying we need a bit of time just to, because we need to look at the results in detail, but how one could read this is that people are actually disenchanted with the process. And the extreme end of that is that a great many people who are actually the heart of the revolution have boycotted the elections, because their position, and I think it's an honorable and a true position, was that these elections are illegitimate because they are run under the aegis of the military, and the military lost legitimacy when it started shooting Egyptian citizens. Therefore, they will not, that joining in them will legitimize the military, will make them look like they're decent people, and therefore they would not take part. So, people like me in the revolution, but with sort of a bit more pragmatism, decided that since this was the door that was open, this was the door that we would go through for the moment. And I think that we'll find that the revolution, having dispersed from Tahrir Square, which was the first mistake, of course, to leave on the 11th of February. But having done that, and then now having been faced with the might and this, you know, the cunning of the military, it has actually dispersed into lots of different places. And so, apart from the immediate revolutionary actions on the ground that still happen, you've got all the strikes, for example. You've got all the court cases that people are bringing forward to, you know, to try and push things legal. And you've got the political action, which has manifested itself in taking part in the elections, in fielding a candidate, in trying to put political pressure on Parliament. I mean, the fact that the first day that Parliament convened, the 23rd of January, all of us, even people who had not voted this Parliament in, marched to Parliament to say, okay, you are now our representatives, we want you to take power. We want you to take power from the military. And Parliament refused and said, we're not ready to take power. And we said, well, why did you put yourselves up for election? So basically, there is a strand of the revolution that, or let's look at it this way. The revolution is like a wave, and it will push and it will go wherever there is a chink for it to go through. Some gaps are wider than others. Those are the strikes. Some are continuing, like the work on the streets, and some are narrow, like elections. Now, even in elections, somebody like Hamdin Sabahi or like Abu al-Futuh would not ultimately have been the revolution's choice, but they could have moved us forward into a new phase, and therefore we tried that avenue. Now it's been closed. We'll see what happens.
Well, you're going to have a choice, aren't you? You can not vote at all in the second round, which is on the 16th of June, or you can vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, or you can vote for the second person who served Mubarak in the final hours. Not an easy choice.
I think the choice is very, very clear. I will not vote. And I think many of us will not vote, because it is not possible to vote for either. For one of us.
It's pretty depressing, isn't it? You fight for the vote,
well,
and you get it, and you don't use it.
No, we didn't fight for the vote. We fought to change the system. We fought to change how the country is run. Now, normally in a revolution, you don't then have to go through elections. That in itself is an oddity.
Well, it's worth pointing out that you don't have a constitution anyway, so they've just elected, or they may be in the process of just electing somebody who won't know what his powers are.
Well, he doesn't know what his powers are. I mean, the president who comes in, we don't have a constitution, and we don't have agreement on the way that the constitution will be written. The committee that will write the constitution, that's up in the air. And also, the military are very much entrenched. So now you're going to have a president coming in who's going to have a parliament that is completely unused to operating as a power, that is unused to operating in the open and legislating, and a military that will do anything to hang on to the position and the privileges that it has. And hanging on to those positions and privileges make it impossible for the country to move forward and to have the economic renaissance that it so badly needs. So, you know, how is it going to play out? If I may, John, because just before I came in, I have been asking the young people within the revolution sort of all night, you know, okay, what's the position now? What are you thinking? What are you saying? And I just got something which I would very much like to share with you. And this is from, you know, okay. Okay, we've all woken up to what feels like a really, really bad scenario. But here are some positives. 7 million people voted for radical economic change. Okay, so these are the people who voted for Abu al-Futuh and Sabahi. And this, again, is a failing of the progressives and of the left, in that we really, really tried to get those two guys to combine. And that way, we wouldn't even have had to have a repeat. But they wouldn't, because their egos were too big. There was no real difference in their outlooks.
You're really talking about men.
I'm talking about men.
Yeah.
I'm talking about men who are willing to put themselves forward.
A lot of nodding going on in the audience. Mind you, there are a lot of women in here.
So, and 7 million people were mobilized without a serious institutional machine pushing them into the polling stations. This is the other thing to remember, that the Brotherhood vote is very much the machine, because Morsi, nobody knew anything about Morsi. He was even put in as a spare when the man they wanted to put in was disqualified. So that is the Brotherhood machine. For Ahmed Shafi, it is the army machine plus the machine that remains from the old National Democratic Party, Mubarak's party. Now, Ahmed Shafi, there is a cap on the amount of money that you can spend in these elections, and that's £10 million. Ahmed Shafi spent £22 million on hoardings alone. Where did that money come from, and how come he isn't being called to task over it? Where is the electoral committee, and why isn't it calling him in? So basically, yes, okay, they did win, but I don't think that that is as significant as, you know, it could be. So you have 7 million actually voting for change without a machine pushing them. 13 million people did not see religion as the cure for political problems. Then there's the issue of the turnout being low, which means general sort of starting to think that perhaps elections are not the way that that you want to go. And then it feels like a loss that the progressives, so-called progressives, were unable to combine, but that was not a total disaster. Had they been able to form a coalition, they would have won, and political space would have really opened up, but maybe the chance for a really radical change would have passed. And then elections are deeply flawed, and party politics is never able to develop real change, to deliver real change, nor is it actually meant to. So at least now we don't have the illusion of waiting for a messiah to grapple with. We know that it's down to us, and it's down to the people on the ground. If Shafiq wins, that's the army guy, as the army's puppet, he will be unable to run the country. The guy, anyone who's seen him on television, he cannot put a sentence together. I mean, there have been sort of skits with him just kind of,
you know. Sounds quite familiar.
Doesn't it just? Doesn't it just? So, unlike Mubarak, who projected an image of strength and built a personality cult around himself, Shafiq has neither the gravitas nor the time to be able to attract the inevitable anger of the nation to himself alone. When people next erupt, the apparatus behind and around him will be in the firing line. So everything clarifies. Meanwhile, he will be crippled by an uncooperative parliament, which is the Brotherhood parliament. And likewise with Morsi, the Brotherhood man as president. If the Brotherhood control both parliament and the presidency, they will be in a serious position to challenge the army's grip over the country's resources and economy. We will have 4 years of a fight between them, and though the Brotherhood will probably not be able to deal a fatal blow, they will seriously loosen the army's grip, and so on. And it ends with, the coming months are dangerous, the coming days are depressing, but let's remember the long game. We don't want a charming president and a functional parliament. We want to change the system. The revolution is alive.
Well, your final 5 words are, there is no turning back.
No.
So that's an optimistic way of looking at it. I must admit that when I left the square, I thought, this is going to take 10 years.
Yeah.
And the reason one says it's going to take 10 years is because the army has so much power, economic power. They own tourist buses, hotels, chains of shops, you name it, they've got it. And what I wondered, just before I open it up to the audience, what I wondered was the view from Tahrir Square. You've already mentioned Tunis, and the self-immolation of the market trader clearly was the blue touch paper. It lit. Everybody understood that there was a possibility of change. But how do you think Libya looks from Tahrir Square? Do you feel an affinity? Do you think they did what you did, or do you think this was very different and something which you didn't feel any particular?
It's different. Of course, we were gunning for them, obviously, and all the young people were talking to each other, and there started very quickly on, when the revolution started, there started to be talk of this dream of having the road and the railroad that runs, Egypt, Tunis, Libya, and so on. Also, of course, when they actually captured and killed Gaddafi, by then we were wondering whether maybe that was the cleaner route than the one that we were taking.
Did you?
Yeah, people did. I mean, clearly, because we are still...
But you didn't yearn for NATO?
No, totally not. Totally not. But then you have a problem, because the problem is that the Libyans asked for NATO. So while, one's heart and principles are very, very much against foreign intervention, you can't, as a non-Libyan, stand against it if the Libyans are asking for it. So it's a complex situation.
And how does Syria look from Tahrir Square?
Well, Syria, we keep... there's a constant vigil outside the Syrian embassy and outside the Arab League. Syria, of course, looks it looks both incredibly impressive. You keep sort of checking in, because they send out live streaming all the time, and you can just see people carrying on with their manifestation is dancing the dabka, which is just incredible in the face of
What is the dabka? High kicking?
No, it's the sort of stamping and the national dance. And so it looks like it could do with real honest support, and it looks like it's going to be pressured until it all sort of becomes very, very factional, and now already it's spilling out into Lebanon. And of course the other thing is that we very, very much feel that it is and that's another massive reason why we need to get our act together.
One of the things which struck me was that I was looking, as one always does in the Middle East, for things which would fit the vernacular, would fit our narrative that we work with. And that was, there would be slogans about Israel, or about America, or about Palestine. And there were none. In Tahrir Square, everything was about Egypt. And that I found rather uplifting. They were not saying, we want to drive Israel into the sea, or, there was nothing... There was nothing about the usual kind of power play that goes on in the Middle East. It was about a better life for the people who lived in Egypt.
Okay. Yes, of course. Tahrir and the revolution is about Egypt. Just a very, very quick, and I know you know this, but this whole thing of driving Israel into the sea, what Nasser said was let them drink the sea, which is an idiom which means let them do whatever they want. And that, of course, became we will drive them into the sea and so on. This whole... now, yes, Tahrir is about Egypt, but in fact, if you are going to run Egypt in the interests of Egyptians, then you're going to have to deal with the issue of Israel. For a start, we don't want to export our gas to Israel, and we certainly don't want to export it to them at lower than cost, and we don't want to export it to them while they are still killing Palestinians and appropriating land and so on. We want sovereignty over our own borders. Rafah should be open and working in the interests of Egypt and whoever Egypt sees as her friends. Sinai is part of Egypt, and there should not be a treaty in existence which we respect, which forbids us from developing Sinai and having it as an inhabited place with factories and schools and people, and having had to leave it in the state it's in. since 79 has meant it has become riddled with crime, with drugs. The inhabitants are demanding that Sinai be developed, that it can't just be left. So basically, Tahrir was not about Israel or about Palestine, it was about Egypt. But Egypt is also about reclaiming its own sovereignty and the way it runs its own affairs, and also about taking up its responsibilities in the region. And part of its responsibility is towards Palestine. So, that becomes clear. And the two songs that came, when Mubarak fell on the 11th, and the songs went out through the megaphones, the very first song was an Abd al-Halim Hafiz song, Bil Ahdan, which is, it's like when you meet somebody after a long absence and you just sort of grab them in your arms. It was Bil Ahdan, our country. Okay, so it was a reclaiming of Egypt. The second was an anthem called Al-Watan Al-Akbar, the Greater Nation. And it was an anthem of the 60s which was sung by many singers from different parts of the Arab world, and it was about unity. And the whole unity thing is very much part of the discourse and is part of the revolution and is part of the dream of the young people. Arab techies, for example, who are working pan-Arab with each other across the net, have actually started the idea of setting up an office for Arab techies. These are obviously nerds, software people and so on, in every liberated Arab capital. The idea of the rail track, of roads. The Arab world is a unit in terms of its language, its to an extent its culture. It has tremendous potential as a unit that needs to trade with itself, that needs to talk to itself, that needs to send its artists to each other, and so on. And so this, without needing to go back to Nasserism, it seems completely obvious. I know that Europe is now looking as if it's going to disintegrate, but surely the drive is for areas to talk to each other, to trade with each other, to create.
I thought there might be many consequences from the book, but trying to resolve the euro crisis wasn't one of them. But I think the aspiration is absolutely honourable and hopeful. I wondered actually, finally, from Tahrir Square, what Britain looks like, given that you shuttle between the two.
Well, I can tell you that one of the things that was constantly being said was people were very much noting what was happening to the students who were out there demonstrating against cuts and who were, manhandled and ill-treated and so on. And also, obviously, there was a conversation going on with the Occupy Wall Street and with the Occupy here. And it was very instructive for us that it turned out that the pavement outside St. Paul was actually private property, and that citizens on it were trespassing and had no right to be there. That was very eye-opening. And there was the position of the canon of St. Paul's who decided that he was going to follow Christ's example, and he therefore in conscience had to resign. That had tremendous resonance. And so really I do believe, I know it's kind of odd to say this in this extremely kind of sort of pleasant and settled place, but I think that we are looking at young people across the world, talking to each other and looking for a different way of doing things. And I don't think it's completely insane, because looking at, there's a book that's just reviewed in this issue of the LRB, which is about climate change and about what's happening to the world. And it's not by some radical young hothead. I mean, my head is so sort of crammed full of stuff that things just vanish. So I've forgotten the name. But look up the LRB. And basically, there is a serious question about the ability of electoral processes and democracies as we know them now, in the form that we know them now, their ability to deliver the change and the results that the world now needs. And I really believe that young people everywhere are looking for different models that would enable people to actually, that would just shift the power from the elites and the corporations and the money to people, and make it possible for people to make the best of themselves, and make it possible for us to do something that will preserve the planet and make it possible for children and grandchildren to have decent lives. That's what I think is happening.
We've looked sideways at the presence of techies and the rest of it, but the presence of the social network in Tahrir Square was structural. I mean, a combination of Facebook with Wahil Gonin, who led this extraordinary online action. That's surely one of the things which has contributed to this questioning of democratic systems. I was also interested as a journalist that in many ways one of the biggest manifestations in the Middle East was actually in Israel, but it didn't fit the Western reporting vernacular because it wasn't about Palestine, it wasn't about peace, but it was about inequality and about the fact that 7 families controlled the economy. And it attracted almost no coverage in the mainstream British and American media. And I wondered whether the people of Tahrir felt any sense of, hey, that's interesting. Probably didn't know about it either.
No, they knew about it. They knew about it.
But I mean, there were 350,000 people in Tel Aviv one weekend on the streets.
Yeah, sure. And as far as Tahrir Square is concerned, well, good for them. But basically, they were talking about social inequalities really within a particular population. No, I don't mean even about Palestinians under occupation. No. I mean about Palestinians living in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel were somehow outside this.
Yes,
and they went in and they tried to be part of it, and they set up a tent for 1948 and nobody would talk to them and so on. So it's problematic. So fine, they can do their own thing. But it is separate and different. Yeah,
no, I recognise that, but I think it had to be noted.
It was.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, finally, on the internet thing, I mean, would Tahrir Square have worked without it?
It's kind of an odd question because Tahrir Square did work without it, but
in part
it was necessary. Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically, the whole internet thing was a really, really important tool. It enabled people, as you know, to create communities at a time when it was, I mean, basically because we've been living under emergency laws in Egypt since 1981, the situation was that any 5 people meeting were automatically illegal and could be arrested. So therefore, to have the social networks making it possible for people to create communities was really important, and as a method of communication. And people had been using SMSs on mobiles, and then, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So it was really important. But then people had to go out on the street. You had to physically go out and be there. You could not conduct a revolution in the virtual hemisphere. You couldn't do that. And so people had to go out. And so actually when the government shut down communications, and for however many days we were without networks at all, it kind of concentrated things. It made it so that you couldn't take part except by being out there on the street, and so people came out. But it's a tool. It's a terrific tool, and of course it's enabling what I was just talking about: people in Oakland talking to people in Tahrir, talking to people in Athens.
Mm-hmm. Well. Ahdaf, thank you very much. I think I'd like to open it up to the floor if anybody has. There's an immediate hand over there. Thank you very much. And now, so I'll take the first question there, and then I'll come to Janet over here.
There's a mic right next to you.
You've made it very clear to us, and we saw it ourselves on television, that women were at and are at the actual heart of the revolution in Egypt. If, as seems possible, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate will become president, how will that affect the political possibilities for women in Egypt?
Thanks.
Very good question.
Yeah. Do you want to take the other one, or shall I just...
No, let's have a... I think
right, I don't think it's really the president. So, I mean, the president will, if the Brotherhood president comes in, then he strengthens the hand of Parliament. But I think we are already in a situation where, because you have you have the Islamist parliament, you might run into trouble. Two members of parliament, one unfortunately a woman, Dr. Azza El-Garaf, and have already spoken about legislation that would roll back laws that have been passed, that have been good for women over the last 20 years. Now, of course, what they're using, and it's beautiful how people can appropriate the rhetoric of the revolution, that they are saying that these laws were Suzanne Mubarak's laws and therefore they have to be removed. Now, of course, this is completely disingenuous, because if you opened a bakery, it became Suzanne Mubarak's bakery. You know, I mean, everything was Suzanne Mubarak's. It meant nothing at all. They are, at the moment, talking specifically about lowering the age of marriage for girls and about lowering the age of custody, because at the moment, Egyptian law gives automatic custody to the mother for a boy until he's 12 and for a girl until she's 15, and they want to bring that back down. It's worth noting that these are just suggestions, that nothing has been adopted by the legislative committee. So they could be flying balloons, there could be an argument within the party, we don't know. But a point to note as well is that the laws that we have arrived at over the last 20 years and that are good for women have been very painstakingly arrived. I mean, they are beautiful pieces of law, because in Egypt, personal law is within Sharia. Other law isn't, criminal and commercial and so on, but personal law, i.e. inheritance and divorce and custody and so on, are within Islamic Sharia. And because nobody wanted to actually shake that, there were brilliant sort of workings out of interpretations that would allow the law to be altered to privilege women. And that has been a brilliant exercise, and it's been ijtihad. It's been, working out how Sharia can be made to fit in a new circumstance and a new age, and they've been amazing, beautiful pieces of legislation. So to simply roll them back, I think it's going to be difficult, and I think also they're going to have a huge fight on their hands. And I don't think that it's just going to be the women. I mean, I seriously believe that every decent man is a feminist, and they will not, we're not going to sit back and just let them do this. So we'll see. But it's